I want to welcome everyone to this special conversation this afternoon with Bishop Robert Barron and Rocco Buttiglione as we explore the witness of St. John Paul II. My name is John Henry Crosby. I'm the founder and president of the Hildebrand Project, and we are delighted to host this conversation. This theme of witness is one of the significant ways in which von Hildebrand and John Paul II are kindred spirits. The unity of thought and practice, of thought and life in both of their work is an outstanding feature, and it's one of the reasons why the Hildebrand Project, in addition to our primary focus on von Hildebrand, has a great interest in the legacy and the continuation of the philosophical and spiritual legacy of the Holy Father as well. This conversation could not be more timely in a sense, and there's even a kind of urgency around the legacy of John Paul II. I noticed when the centenary of the Holy Father's birth came around recently, and I think many others noticed this as well, at what at other times had been an occasion with tremendous celebration and with much coverage in the media, with commentary and assessments of the legacy of John Paul II, it was a relatively quiet centenary celebration. And for those of us old enough to remember what it was like to live during and immediately after the John Paul II era, this was not a familiar experience for us. And so this conversation will explore the legacy of John Paul II with a special view to his witness, his Christian witness, but it will also look at some of the reasons why perhaps there's a risk of a certain forgetfulness of John Paul II. And I think we will also explore the reasons why there should continue to be a great confidence among Catholics in the magisterium of John Paul II, and not a concern that perhaps it is not fitting for the needs of our time. I've heard increasingly, and I think our panelists have heard as well, some people beginning to say, even in Catholic circles, that the project of John Paul II, whatever that might be, has failed or is not sufficient to our times. And I think that our panelists believe that is the farthest thing from the truth. But in the spirit of John Paul II, we won't just assert that, we will try to explain that in today's conversation. But before we go into the meat of that discussion, I thought I would open by inviting our two panelists to say just a word about perhaps some particular moment in their experience of the papacy of John Paul II, whether in person or simply as members of the church, watching his leadership of the church, something that made a profound impact or an experience on the two of you. I'm realizing as I invite this of you that I've not really introduced you all sufficiently, and I think that's perhaps a reflex on the part of me, because I know that virtually everyone who's with us today know who our two speakers are. I think Bishop Barron needs no introduction, but in any case, he is the founder and the leader of Word on Fire Ministries, which is one of the most extraordinary evangelization projects in the church today. He has been a collaborator with the Hildebrand Project, has written a number of forewords for us, and we're delighted to have him here. And Rocco Buttiglione, I will just offer a brief word of introduction, is a great friend of the Hildebrand Project, a collaborator since the very beginning of our work. What gives him a unique position to address the theme of today is that he was a great close friend and collaborator of the Holy Father. The Holy Father played, I think, the decisive role in bringing you into politics. And when there were moments when you thought perhaps you wanted to get out of politics, he was the decisive role in keeping you in. He thought we needed courageous Catholic voices in European and Italian politics. So, but of course, your collaboration with the Holy Father extended far beyond politics, and you were the person who brought innumerable people to him, whom the Holy Father met and was able to interact with. So we're delighted to have you here, Rocco, from Rome, and Bishop Barron, you from California. So I turn it over to you. Rocco, maybe I'll impose on you to go first, since this is a topic so near and dear your heart.
Well, you want a personal memory. June 2nd, 1979, Victory Place in Warsaw, an enormous crowd. The Pope has just arrived, the first visit of a Pope in a communist country. And there is an enormous crowd. I cannot say how many we were there. And in front of all, the Pope says, you cannot understand the history of Poland if you take out of this history the cross of Jesus Christ. Only with this history, with this cross, this history becomes an history of hope. And I have never heard again in so many years such a profound silence and then such a thundering applause. It is difficult perhaps for you to understand. The strength of communism was the disconfiance. People did not trust one another and people had no hope. The first time as I went to Poland, I remember everybody, my friends, told me, don't trust him, don't trust her, don't trust this person, don't trust that, don't talk to him. Everybody was suspicious because they were afraid of the secret police. And the strength of the regime was exactly the fault of the reciprocal confidence among the people. They were isolated individuals, they were not a people. You could talk only within restricted groups of people. And then all of a sudden we were there. And we were a people in front of the word of John Paul II, calling us to the essence of the Polish nation, that is the evangelization and the encounter with Christ. We discovered that we were brothers and we could trust one another and we could talk to one another. There was a great Polish philosopher near to me, Józef Tischner. He died young, but he was a great philosopher. And he told me, Rocco, something has got to happen. Nobody knows what, but something has got to happen. Nothing will be again as it was before. After 1 year, August 1980, Lech Wałęsa enters into the shipyard of Danzig and the movement Solidarność begins and history changes.
I think we may have Rocco frozen for a moment. Bishop Barron, feel free to jump in here for a...
Yeah, no, thank you. And delighted to talk about, I never met John Paul II, never had the opportunity, but he meant the world to me. I joined the college seminary in the fall of 1978. When I was interviewing for the seminary, Paul VI was Pope. When I went through the doors of the seminary, John Paul I was Pope. And by October of that year, John Paul II was Pope. So he was Pope during all those years of my seminary training, all the years of, first 19 years of my priesthood. And what a model to have. I'll tell you, the first time I laid eyes on him was the following year. So it would have been the fall of 79, just after the events that Rocco was describing. That was June of 79. This would have been like September, October. John Paul came to Washington. And by that time, I was at Catholic U as a student of philosophy. So we were all out on the front of theological college facing the shrine in Washington. John Paul arrived. And, you know, people younger than I don't remember the John Paul superstar era. A lot of people, if they remember him, they remember maybe the very old and infirm John Paul. But I remember 1979, he was, 59 years old. You could tell he was both an actor and an athlete, full of life, standing in the car and exuding confidence and joy. He comes to the front steps of the shrine, and we're all shouting, all the kids are shouting, John Paul II, we love you, right? So finally, he comes to the microphone and he says, John Paul II, he love you. But then he said, he love you more because he love you with microphone. So that was the first time I experienced him. And then the following day, there was mass at the mall in Washington. And I'll never forget, it was a very cloudy day, overcast. But then suddenly there was John Paul, and he was standing up in the car and was moving along one of the streets there toward the mall. He had the white cassock, he had the red cape, again, exuding confidence. And as he came by, I remember the sun came out. And he delivered this extraordinary homily that day. You can look it up, 1979 on the mall in Washington. But we all knew, okay, there's something new. There's a fresh wind blowing in the church. There's this great personality. I'll use it in von Hildebrand sense, right? This great personality had emerged. And I just say, one of the great blessings of my life was that personality emerged precisely when I was entering the seminary. And he was the lodestar for me and so many people in my generation.
Yes, indeed. There was a whole generation of JP2 vocations, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Probably just after you, but
inspired
by his witness.
By the time I was a seminary professor and seminary rector, I knew the John Paul II generation very well, those who had come of age under John Paul and were influenced by him.
Yes, indeed. Rocco, you've spoken about the influence of John Paul II in the collapse of communism. But let's talk a little bit more broadly about John Paul II's relation to the Second Vatican Council, because this seems to be one of the aspects of JP2 and his magisterium that creates much of the concern and resistance today, if we can put it in those broad terms. What would you say about his relationship to the Council? The way I know that my parents, when they first met the Holy Father, when they also first met you, often spoke of John Paul having given us the true meaning of the council, because they had lived in this prior period in which there was tremendous confusion about the meaning of the council. And as a result, there was a great deal of suspicion over it. And it tended to make traditionalists out of people. And then John Paul comes along and he offers something new. How would you explain that?
Well, John Paul II was a man of the council, no doubt. And he thought that the council was the church that enters within the transcendental horizon of the modern man. Each one of us is a culture. We live within a culture. And the culture we live in shapes our fundamental convictions. We are not in a direct touch with the eternal truth. We are in a direct touch with the historical truths that are commonplace and are accepted in our historical environment. And so there is an historical environment of the modern man that is different from the historical environment of the Middle Ages. And all historical environments, all historical transcendental horizons are equally legitimate. A great historian, Leopold von Ranke, said once, all ages are equally far away from God, or equally near to God. It is true. The church must enter in the transcendental horizon of the man of today in order to be present in the life of the man of today. And this was for Wojtyła a personal experience as a priest who was in charge of the university students in the city of Krakow. Mm-hmm. What is the defect, not of the council, of many of those who have pretended to be the interpreters of the council? The idea that, well, the transcendental horizon of the man of today is a non-religious transcendental horizon. It is in the language of the man of today. You cannot say the word God. So we must offer to the men of today, not Jesus Christ in the full greatness of his presence in our life and in world history. We must give them a reduced Jesus Christ that is compatible with the dogmas of our time. And here, on the contrary, Wojtyła thought that modernity is not a solution to the human problem. It's a way of formulating the human problem. Jesus Christ is the answer. And this answer is valid when the question is formulated in the language of the Middle Ages, when it is formulated in the language of Chinese culture, of African culture, of Aztec culture, and of course also of the man of today. He entered into this horizon, but to break it, there is a kindred spirit, Hans Urs von Balthasar, who once said, Gottes Wort sprengt Grenzen, Gottes Wort schafft Zukunft. The word of God breaks up the jails in which the human spirit shuts up itself. The word of God creates future. And you have seen, he spoke to the men of today in the language of today, but he brought the men of today to break the limits of our traditional vision of reality and open new horizons. That is the council. Unfortunately, I see that very often it works in the other way. We imagine that we must reduce the word of God in such a way that it becomes compatible with the word of today, as if the word of today did not stand in need of the presence of Jesus Christ. And when I look at I beg your pardon, Mr. Bishop, Eccellenza, but when I look to the church discussion today in the United States and in Europe, and in other parts of the world also, it seems to be a clerical affair. The only problems that are really important are the problems of the employees and of the employed in the church. I recognize how important it is, the problem, let us say, of clerical celibacy or of the Latin Mass, but we must love the Mass more than the Latin. And in the time of John Paul II, and I hope also in our time, the church has spoken to the heart of man, going to what is essential. Later, all other problems will come, each one in its own place, and will find the proper solution, or perhaps will not find the proper solution. But in the end, it does not matter, because the essence is that the word of God be heard, and that man can be possessed the true love of Jesus Christ. And he spoke to the hearts of men, not only of the individuals. He did speak to the hearts of the individuals, but he spoke to the hearts of nations. Nations are a reality in history, and they were not dead. Everybody thought they were dead. They were not dead. They were asleep. And he woke them up. And they woke up. And they made history. The history that has changed the world in which I was born. Creating a new world. A new world that is perfect? No. A new world in which the message of John Paul II is won? No. A new world in which there are new challenges. And we must find new words in the spirit of St. John Paul II to meet these challenges and to break the new jails, the new prisons in which the spirit of man is attempting to shut up itself.
Bishop Barron, I'll let you comment on that. There's so much there in what Rocco has just shared.
Well, let me say a word about the council, because you brought that up first. Another great grace in my life was a relationship with the Cardinal George of Chicago. I had the privilege of living with him at least part-time for about 5 years. And of course, he had tremendous reverence for John Paul II. So we talked a lot about him. Cardinal George used to say, what people miss is that Vatican II was a missionary council. He said, unlike, for example, Nicaea, Chalcedon, Trent, even Vatican I, it wasn't there to settle major doctrinal issues. There was indeed doctrinal development at Vatican II. So under the aegis of Newman's notion of development, that certainly happened. But as John the 23rd saw, and Francis George reiterated this, what they wanted to achieve was the act now of bringing the richness and treasures from the church into the world. So like Lumen Gentium, bring the lumen of Christ to the Gentes. That was the purpose of Vatican II. And so some of these adjustments in language and style and strategy that Rocco was talking about, that's all subordinate to the missionary purpose of Vatican II. Rocco cited Balthasar, the great book that he wrote in the 50s called Schleifung der Bastionen, right? The knocking down of the bastions. What he meant was the church, he thought, was crouching too much behind its medieval walls. And it was keeping its treasure, if you want, to itself. The idea was to knock down the walls, not so much to let the modern world in, but to let the church out. Let the beauty and treasure of the church out so as to transform the world. Now, I can witness to this. What happened, Cardinal George bemoaned this all the time. I lived through it. That in the immediate wake of the council, instead of this missionary elan, very often the church turned inward and fussed about its own inner life, its own inner disciplines, when the whole purpose of Vatican II was a missionary purpose to go out. Now, read the new evangelization. That's precisely what, beginning with John the 23rd and Paul VI with Evangelii Nuntiandi, coming right up through John Paul II, that was simply taking up the mantle of the council. Now, with the richness and treasures of the church, we go out to the world. I would say today you do indeed have, from both left and right, a missing of that point. I think you've got on both left and right today a suspicion of Vatican II. On the left, hard left if you want, if the church is in permanent revolution, it's permanently open to paradigm changes, well then we're not going to go out with confidence. We don't know who we are. See, mind you, John Paul II, I remember this vividly, very early in his papacy, disciplined Hans Küng. Now maybe your younger viewers don't even remember who Hans Küng was, but go back to the 70s, 80s, probably the most famous theologian in the world, said some valuable things, but also become kind of a dissenting figure. John Paul disciplined him very early on. He withstood a barrage of criticism for it. What was he doing though? He was carefully now ordering and defining the church, not so that it could stay turned inward, but that it could now go out with confidence to meet the world. The trouble, if you want, with the extreme left is if the church is constantly questioning itself, constantly opening to revolution and changing of paradigms, then we won't go out to meet the world boldly. On the right, if you want, extreme right, there's also a suspicion of Vatican II. There's a suspicion of the text of Vatican II, a desire to go back to the Bastione, right? Go back to the preconciliar thing. I think recovering the great magisterium and style of John Paul II, which is robustly Catholic. We know who we are. There's a doctrinal stability and order and a missionary elan. Duc in altum, go out into the depths. We're not meant to stay fussing with the ship in the harbor. No, when the ship is ship shape, out you go with a missionary spirit. To me, that's Vatican II. And to me, that's John Paul II, who, as Rocco said, was a man of the council par excellence, right? He was at the council. He was instrumental in the shaping of Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes and the Statement on Religious Liberty. He was a man of the council, and I think he bore the council to the world with remarkable panache.
Yes, well, very well said. Rocco.
May I add one point, John Henry?
Yes, of course.
Karol Wojtyła, when he was cardinal, he made a great synod of Krakow, a synod to appropriate the spirit of the council. And the spirit of the council is the spirit of mission, is the spirit of a church that does not defend herself, that is not in a defensive position. And everybody in those years would say, how can we stop defending ourselves? We stand under a continuous aggression of the communist regime. No, we are open to all, we want to talk to all. We speak in the name of the nation. And we speak to the nation, making the nation conscious of the fact that the word of Jesus Christ gives you the true meaning of your existence as an individual and as a nation. And this turned things upside down. This created a new people. Before beginning the synod, John Paul II had written a book, Podstawy Odnowy, at the sources of the renewal. And there was everything there in already. Then I asked him, but why do you make a synod if you already know everything? And he told me, well, the problem of the synod is not the documents. The documents more or less will be similar to what is already written in my book. The result of the synod are 50,000 persons in the diocese of Krakow who have learned to be church, to be brothers to one another, to work with one another, to take the word, to take the floor in front of the word, in defense, not of the rights of the church, of the rights of man according to the measure that Jesus Christ has revealed to us. Let us put in the center, not the church, but Jesus and the church. Because the church is the presence of Jesus in our time. It's not a clerical institution. It's the presence of a new force of life. But I don't feel in myself the new force of life. Well, don't worry. Pray, follow me, and take your step forward. And when you will be in front of the world and everybody will be judging you, then you will feel the Spirit of Jesus in you. And the Spirit of Jesus will put on your tongue the words that you have to say. That was the impulse of the council in Krakow and in Poland. Another point I think is relevant. Wojtyła, and here I must quote another great man of God, Cardinal Wyszynski. Wyszynski and Wojtyła were not always of the same opinion, but they felt deeply that they were one church and they had to work with one another. They were absolutely united. All their differences notwithstanding. And they both had this idea. The popular piety, the popular religiosity is not something that should be despised. An error of many has been that of looking for a bourgeois religiosity, thoroughly individual, and despising the devotions of the people. The devotion of the people is the presence of the Spirit of God in the history of the people. And of course, it may be biased, yes. There may be defects, yes. It may be better formulated theologically, yes. But nevertheless, this is the way that the Spirit of God has chosen to enter into the life of the Polish nation, of humanity, more broadly. And you must correct, yes, but you must never despise, and you must correct in order that it may grow more. The great pilgrimage to the Virgin of Częstochowa has been not has been set aside. Many Polish intellectuals, even some of my friends, would add a certain attitude of saying, well, that's just for the common people, it is not for us. No, if you are not there, you are not the intellectual of these people. You cannot lead these people if you are not with them in front of the Mother of God. And the Marian piety, all this was, yes, reformulated, but increasing, not diminishing, not set aside. The council is not a renegation on the history of the church. It is a new way, a stronger way to assume in the perspective of remission, of leading also the others to understand why it is important and why they should come with us.
You know, when the two of us spoke the other day, we spoke about traditionalism and the various conceptions of the tradition that are invoked. And we spoke about the dangers of sort of particular points in the church's history being identified as the preferred anchors for a vision of what the church's tradition should be. Then Hildebrand, of course, participated in some of those battles insofar as they brought him into sometimes feisty interaction with the Thomists of his day, and of course those debates continue with us in a new sort of way, as we discussed the other day. I'm wondering if the two of you could perhaps say something. Maybe Bishop Barron, you could speak first a little bit about the resurgent traditionalisms of the day and how you perceive them.
Well, I'm a traditionalist, meaning I stand in the great tradition of Christian revelation, the great tradition of the church, which is a living tradition, which very much includes the Second Vatican Council. And so to me, it's impossible to repudiate Vatican II and claim to be a traditionalist. So that's one concern I have, is I do see in some so-called traditionalists a repudiation of Vatican II, and indeed a repudiation of John Paul II's reading of it. So I don't think that's a valid position to hold at all. When it comes to the tradition, I'm with John Henry Newman, your namesake. Newman says that the way an animal goes out into its environment, assimilating what it can, resisting what it must. So an animal that simply assimilates its environment will be in very short order a dead animal, right? It has no power of resistance. It's overcome by its environment. By the same token, an animal that simply goes out and utterly resists the environment is also in short order a dead animal. Animals have to assimilate what they can, resist what they must. That to me is the church in regard to any culture in which it finds itself. So it's always making its way through a culture, whether it's the culture of dying Rome for St. Augustine, whether it's the culture of kind of an ascendant Christianity in the 13th century, whether it's a culture of the post-French Revolution, whether it's our culture, the church makes its way, the Church of Jesus Christ, assimilating what it can, So all the great thinkers from Augustine through John Paul II that looked around at the culture and said, well, yeah, that we can use, or that's redolent of the faith, or those are semina verbi that can be watered, you know. And at the same time, resisting what it has to. So every culture is inimical to some degree to Jesus Christ. There are things in any culture that are problematic. The church has to stand athwart it. When I was coming of age, so go back to the 1970s, what was the watchword of the time? It was all the culture. The culture sets the tone for the church, the world, and so on. Well, okay, cultures are great and cultures are fallen. Cultures have positive features, cultures are compromised. The church goes out the way a canny, surviving animal goes out. Assimilating, yes. Resisting, yes. And that's what keeps the animal alive, you know? So I've learned to resist, you know, both these hyper-confident views of the culture and hyper-defensive views. They're both wrong. They're both going to result in a dead animal. But it's the church that's got some moxie and it's got some flexibility and it knows how to survive. The Church of Augustine and Aquinas and John Paul II is like that. So that's how I look at the church and its great tradition vis-a-vis any culture in which it finds itself.
Rocco, would you like to add to that?
Yes. I am also a traditionalist. Tradition comes from the Latin, tradere. One generation consigns to the following generation the values that they have experienced as true in their life. But tradition is not an object, it's a process. I have the right to put to test the values that my father, that the generation of my parents gave to me. And I have the right to put to test them in my life. And this is what Wojtyła did. With these young people, he put the text in their lives, the values, in order to set them aside? No, in order to rediscover them. Because there is one truth, but many ways leading to truth. And each generation, each country, each man in the last instance has his own path to truth. And the role of a priest is that to be a company to each one of these men in their search for the truth, not only an objective truth of themselves. The process is how the objective truth can become the truth of my life. And this is the message of the council, a methodological message. The truth does not change. But yesterday, we thought that it was enough to say, well, who does not agree with truth, anathema sit, be he excluded from the life of the church. Today, this does not work. We have first to lead the people to the church. Later, perhaps we will be able to expel somebody from the church. But first of all, you have to lead them. And you have to look for the place where they are. If you expect young people to come to the parish church, probably, I don't know in the United States, in Italy, they will not come. You have to go and look for them there where they are. I had a tremendous spiritual experience with Don Luigi Giussani in the movement Comunione Liberazione. He came to take us where we were, in the interest, in the living interest of our lives, speaking our language. And he taught us to do the same with the other young people. That's the missionary movement of the church. So tradition is a living process. And I feel profoundly identified, not with the Vatican Council #2 only, but also with Vatican Council #1, and with John Paul II, and also with Paul VI, and also with Pius IX, and with Gregory XVI, the most reactionary priest, pope of the history of the church. But if you read him and you understand him in the context of his own time, you see that the fundamental message of Gregory XVI is not different from that of John Paul II, of Pope Francis, of all the popes. There is one problem here. We all suffer a lack of understanding of history. Catholics have had metaphysics, good metaphysics, bad metaphysics, I don't know, but they've had always a metaphysics. But in the last 100 years, they have not had a reading of the history of mankind, we have tremendously lacked a philosophy of history and a theology of history, with some great exceptions, of course. And then we do not enter into the life of the people because we want them first to learn metaphysics, and then we speak about life. No, we must speak about life. And metaphysics is useful because it helps you to get deeper into the life of the world.
I just say, as we're talking, I keep thinking of Newman. So that theme is a key one. Newman, a brilliant man, obviously, but was much more kind of historical in his thinking than metaphysical. And I think Newman was the most influential figure at Vatican II who was not physically on the scene. And in development of doctrine, the way the traditions understood, the missionary impulse, the turn to history, all of that, I think, was a contribution of Newman. Think of through the people at the council, whether it's to Lubac or Bouillet, Balsar, who wasn't there but was influential, a lot of Newman's disciples had an impact at Vatican II. So he's someone I keep turning to, and I know, John Henry, you and I were present at, Rocco was there too, at Newman's canonization last fall, but I think he was a premier figure at Vatican II.
Yes, that was a wonderful moment, wasn't it? Meeting on the steps of St. Peter's after the canonization. In fact, we had just come out of we had just been venerating the tomb of John Paul II before we ran into you. So we have John Paul and John Henry Newman. Well, let's move to a topic which is important. Go ahead, Rocco.
May I just
Please.
1 point? You must forgive me. I am an Italian. I heard Newman quoted, and I must say there is another saint that is very important for us in this moment. Is Antonio Rosmini. Rosmini gave us the idea of risorgimento, the resurrection. The fundamental values, they never die. They resurrect in different ages according to different modalities. You cannot imagine that repeating the words of 100 years ago, you will convey the values of 100 years ago. You must find the new words that convey the same values. And this is the idea of the truth as modalities. And we must discover the modality of truth in our time. And we do that. John Paul II was very fond of this idea. You do that. Yes, studying, writing books, but first of all, following the saints of your time. He made so many saints because he wanted people to learn from the example of the saints. Watch, and of course, not only the saints on the altars. So the vast majority of saints are not on the altars. And you in your life, you have met some saints. And very often you don't want really to listen to them. You don't want to listen to your heart that points towards them. And that's wrong, because you change following the example of the saints, who are men who may be sinners. There is no contradiction between being saint and sinner at the same time. And nevertheless, through their life, they give witness to Jesus Christ, who has shaped their lives and may shape your life too.
Bishop Barron, Rocco, what would you say to someone hearing you who would say, I understand the way in which Vatican II wanted to put the church fully into a missionary mode, but who would wonder whether it's correct and adequate to say that that, for example, the preoccupations with the liturgy, including the abuses around the liturgy, not just the question of Latin, but also the insipid and trivializing tendencies in the Mass, that these are somehow internal issues, or these are, that this is nothing but sort of ecclesial navel gazing. I don't think you all would say that, but for those who might hear this talk of the church needs to evangelize and these other things, the liturgy and so on are, and of course the liturgy is very different from the more administrative matters that you've mentioned, Rocco, in the church, but also celibacy, some might see in that deeper, more substantial theological questions that they also associate with the church's continuing teaching. So I just wonder what you all would say to someone who feels anxious about the talk of the missionary posture of the church and wonders whether we're not letting sort of vital and essential dimensions fall away.
Well, no, because the liturgy itself is evangelical in purpose. As we give right praise to God, the world becomes rightly ordered. It's a basic biblical idea. One way to read original sin, it seems to me, is bad praise. So the human being is designed to praise God. When we praise God, we become rightly ordered on the inside. And then around us, right order springs up. Dietrich von Hildebrand's great book on the spirit, on the liturgy, liturgy and personality, is very much along these lines. Read the whole biblical narrative if you want. Israel falls when it worships incorrectly. Who is Jesus but the one now who gives right praise to the Father? So the Son, now having joined to himself a human nature, gives right praise to the Father. What's the Mass but our joining into that great eternal act of praise? Now, the liturgical movement, which had a big impact at Vatican II, people like Romano Guardini and others, in our country, someone like Reinhold Hildebrand, what did they see? That there's a tight link, therefore, between the liturgy and social justice, liturgy and the transformation of the world, liturgy and concern for the poor, liturgy and the spreading of the gospel. And so, as Paul VI said, the church doesn't have a mission, the church is a mission. So in every aspect of its life, liturgy, I would say, in a preeminent way, has a missionary focus. So I don't see looking at the liturgy at all as a kind of, fussing around with one's interiority. That's very much to do with the public witness of the church. The liturgy is the source and summit, right, of the Christian life. That from which it flows, that to which it returns. And so the whole of the church's outreach to the wider world is dependent upon the liturgy and flows from it. So no, I wouldn't want to set up that dichotomy as though the liturgy is interior as opposed to the exterior move. The whole church is evangelical and missionary in nature and focus.
I see. Good. Rocco, what would you say on this point about the concern? And I want to assume sort of good faith here, that these are not people who are
absolutely
purely ideological, but even ordinary people in the pews who wonder about the loss of some Catholic integrity.
Lex orandi, lex credenti. The law of our prayer is the law of our faith, no doubt. But you remember, just before the beginning of this meeting, we were adjusting our technical apparatuses for the meeting that was to come. And Kitty Bible corrected a lot of errors that I had done because she knows much better than me how internet works and all this sort of things. I personally admire very much the old Gregorian songs, the traditional liturgy, Latin, and why not also the Greek liturgy of the Greek Catholic Church. It is wonderful, and we may have a lot to learn from them too. On many points, I shall not deal on this. And when I listen to certain liturgies around the world, well, I am not particularly happy. But the attitude that you should have is, well, there is a lot of liturgical illiteracy in the church of today. Let us try to help them to grow. If Catherine had scolded me without giving me the needed instructions and without being patient and smiling, I would never have succeeded in bettering my limited capacity in this field. So sometimes it seems that one defends a better liturgy just to have the pretext to expel from the church others who do not yet understand it. And if I don't understand, then the liturgy that corresponds to my level of capacity of liturgical appreciation is that I must start there and go forward towards better and better understanding of the liturgy, because the liturgy is only one in the end. There are many forms. There is only one cosmic liturgy, that is the liturgy of God and the angels of God, and they participate in different forms to this liturgy. So I understand those who defend a great liturgical tradition. Only I tell them, wait, you must see the thing from the point of view of those who have just entered into the Catholic Church, who do not possess this tradition, and who have to enter into this tradition patiently. If you try to help them to grow, perhaps you will learn also that from their life experience, there may be some elements that may make the liturgy even better, even richer. And contrasts, contradictions, discussion, passionate discussions are good. There is nothing wrong in it. What worries me is not a struggle between those who defend Latin liturgy and those who defend liturgical experiments. Let us discuss. What is a wound to me is when I say that the one wants to throw out of the church the others. No, we must talk to one another, and in this dialogue, we will all grow. According to the law of graduality, St. Paul says, when you were babies, I have given you milk. Now you're a little bit more grown-ups, and I give you some meat. And tomorrow, perhaps when you will be fully grown-up people, you will be allowed to the glory of eating spaghetti. It's history.
Can I say maybe a quick word about the liturgy too,
Please.
John Henry, that not gainsaying at all what I just said, but I came of age at a time when the liturgy was a little crazy. You know, I came of age in the late 60s and the 70s. I remember balloon masses and clown masses, and I remember mass with a priest coming up the aisle on a motorcycle. I mean, so I lived through all that wild stuff, which was completely alien, of course, to the letter and spirit of Vatican II. I rejoiced in John Paul II, not so much the formal statements, but watch John Paul II as he celebrated the Mass. That had a revolutionary impact on the whole church. Watch this great saintly figure, this great personality in von Hildebrand's sense, saying the Mass the way he did. That brought a lot of us online, you know. Now, another angle to it, the famous debate between the Novus Ordo and the extraordinary form. I have zero quarrel with Benedict XVI opening us up to a wider practice of the extraordinary form. It's done here in Los Angeles. It was done in Chicago, where I used to be. Zero quarrel with it. What I quarrel with is sometimes people who embrace the extraordinary form think the Novus Ordo Mass is just no good. It's just not up to snuff. And my typical response when I hear that is, but it fed the spiritual lives of Mother Teresa and John Paul II. It can't be all bad. They found that Mass richly spiritually uplifting. So that's how I look at that whole range of issues around the liturgy. Those of us who lived through a real corrupt time welcome the way John Paul kind of brought us online. But the Novus Ordo, to me, can be a very powerful and very rich expression of the church's liturgy.
Yes, indeed. I remember when Pope Benedict gave the motu proprio extending the granting the right to celebrate the extraordinary form, he was very explicit in the fact that the Novus Ordo was not being in any way supplanted, that the Novus Ordo remained the norm. Right. And in other places, he speaks about the great beauty with which the Novus Ordo can be said. So I think also, as sort of to channel Rocco here a little bit, it may be that many people have simply not experienced the Novus Ordo said in a beautiful and reverent way.
Watch Pope Francis, by the way. Watch Pope Francis say Mass. I mean, we're a million miles from a balloon Mass, right? I mean, I lived through that. Pope Francis says the Novus Ordo Mass in a very reverent and very focused and very spiritually alert way. Watch him say Mass.
You know who else, and Rocco saw this more than any of us, but the Masses that John Paul II said, especially in his private chapel, which my family had the privilege of experiencing a time or two. The first time as a boy, I was apparently not very reverent because I humiliated my mother by saying very loudly before Mass was over, "When will Mass be over?" And apparently the Holy Father turned around and my mother wanted to melt into the floor, and he smiled at her. He gave her this warm, understanding smile as if I'm telling the story as my father tells it. Of course, I was very young, but as if to say, I understand. This is quite a long thing for a little boy like you. It will be done soon.
It was not your finest moment, though.
You know, luckily it's been uphill since then. I mean, we've been moving in the right direction. But you know, I still remember once in 1997 being at a Mass with him, and you know, the kind of, first of all, the prayerful way in which he said the Mass, and then the way in which he prayed after communion. Yeah. And many people have observed this, and I don't know if this was a particularly extraordinary moment, but I mean, you had the feeling of someone who was totally absorbed and caught up in the Eucharistic reception, and he would groan. I don't know whether he did that on this occasion, but I know many people have experienced this groaning in prayer. Rocco, maybe you can speak to that, but all of that was always in the context of the Novus Ordo Mass. These weren't Latin Masses,
Right.
that he was saying. Rocco, I have to call on you there because, of course, you have the first-hand experience of him in so many respects.
Because you already know the story I'm about to tell.
Okay.
After communion, John Paul II used to have an action of grace that was very intense and very long. And I was at the Mass with my daughters. And Maria Chiara, the third one, was restless. She could not stay there anymore. She began to make noises and to protest. And I confess, Father, I hope you forgive me, John Paul II, I was about to give her a small slap in order to keep her quiet. And John Paul II, who must have had 4 eyes, 2 in front and 2 on the back, he, just in the right moment, he turned around, he made to me like this, he smiled, he blessed us, and he sent us away.
Yes, yes.
No, you were not the only child who had the problems. But you see, what we said, you learn liturgy. At 4 years, when you are 4 years, you cannot understand all the beauty of the ancient Mass. Little by little. I don't mean tomorrow you will make Gregorian Masses in all the world, but you perhaps you'll arrive to make Masses that are equally beautiful as the Gregorian Mass.
That's right. That's right. Yes. Well, let's talk about something that I know is near and dear to both of you.
Excuse me. To be honest to traditionalists, I must say one thing, 2 things.
Please do.
One, I don't understand some traditionalists who do not understand Latin and defend with all their heart Latin Mass that they do not understand at all. On the other hand, I do not understand so many bishops who forbid the Old Mass. Why should it be forbidden? If people feel that this Mass helps them to reach, to feel in the presence of God, and let them pray according to the Old Mass. The Church is a place of liberty also in this area, because some of them feel persecuted. Why should this happen? What are we afraid of?
You know, can I speak to that? When I was rector at Mundelein, outside Chicago, we had some of the students were interested in learning the extraordinary form. And we allowed that, of course, if their bishop was permitting it. But we also made the requirement they had to have a basic knowledge of Latin. So we had to put them through a course. We tested them before. Otherwise, we thought it was silly if they're doing the Latin Mass without understanding what they're saying. So I'm right with you on that, Rocco. I think we said, yeah, sure, if your bishop permits it, you're willing to do it, but you've got to demonstrate some knowledge of Latin. Otherwise, it's more play acting than really entering into the liturgy.
It risks being a sign of identification against the Anglican Church.
Right.
And
Right.
my legitimate way of praying, because I like that.
Yeah.
Yes. And that too often happens, doesn't it, in a particular diocese? Well, let's speak about something near and dear to both of your hearts. Bishop Barron, your ministry is devoted in a central way to the outreach to the unaffiliated, the nuns, as you refer to them. And of course, we underscore that we don't mean religious nuns, but those who
N-O-N-E-S.
The N-O-N-E-S's, yes. And Rocco, of course, you've been the way in which you've expressed yourself has simply exuded this desire to reach people in the ordinary circumstances of their life without presuming extensive theological knowledge, cultural knowledge. And we've shown in this conversation how this is at the very heart of the missionary impulse of Vatican II. But Bishop Barron, you're doing this in a very specific way. I thought it would be interesting for you to say something about how John Paul II lies behind this work as an inspiration for it.
He's entirely behind it, I would say. And if I can invoke Cardinal George again, Cardinal George, as you know, was a very bright, articulate, valuable person. But he was at ad limina visit, or some visit in Rome with John Paul II, who was his absolute hero. And he was making his report on the Archdiocese of Chicago, and the Pope was listening. And finally, the Pope turned to Cardinal George and said, "What are you doing to evangelize the culture?" And again, Cardinal George, who was never lost for words, said he just became tongue-tied and he didn't know what to say in response. And it really bothered him. And so he talked to me and he said, that's what I want you to do. I want you to do the evangelization of the culture. So I kind of felt at that moment, from John Paul through Cardinal George, both of whom were great heroes of mine, came this mission. It wasn't so much the one-on-one evangelization of sitting down with someone in a room. It was reaching out more widely to a culture which has grown, as we all know, increasingly skeptical of religion. The figures, I've been studying this for a long time, are really alarming. It's now fully 26% of our country would identify as a none, as an N-O-N-E. Among Catholics, it's even worse. Catholics under 30, the figure rises to between 40 and 50%, claim no religious affiliation. Well, reaching out in the evangelical spirit to that culture became my mission. When the Cardinal first drew me into this work, I came to live with him. He said, I want to be able to talk to you about this. And that, again, was a marvelous grace, a privilege for me. But the idea we had was I would address people at these centers in downtown Chicago. And I would address them at lunchtime. We'd serve a simple lunch, and then I would give a half-hour talk on some aspect of culture and religion and faith. And they were great. I loved them. They were a lot of fun. We got 200 people or so would come and fill the room. But I finished all that, and I said to Cardinal George, you know, Your Eminence, these are great. I'm glad we've done them. But I said, you know, there's something kind of 19th century about it, gathering people in a room. How much more effective could I be if I use now all the means that social media give us? And that was really the beginning of Word on Fire in its characteristic use of things like YouTube. YouTube was invented in 2006. We started using it in 2007. I said, well, let's just put a video up on some aspect of culture and religion and see what happens. And I was thrilled in the early days when 200 people would watch a video of mine. 60 million views later, it shows what you can do with the new media. Remember John Paul also saying that new evangelization, new in method, new in ardor, new in content. I mean, so we're using the methods available to us through the new media. All of that is John Paul II. All of that is the elan of Vatican II. All of that's the new evangelization. That's what informs Word on Fire.
Bishop Barron, I see some questions here in the Q&A, and this isn't maybe the main purpose of our conversation, but I see it's on people's minds, and I'll ask. Obviously, these numbers that you cited are alarming with the increased the rise in the unaffiliated. I think people are wondering to what extent. What is your response when people say, well, isn't one of the causes of this decline? I mean, obviously you have the modern world as a whole, but isn't one of the causes of this decline, if not Vatican II, at least the abuses that flow from Vatican II? How do you address that?
Well, I'd be okay with the second to some degree. You know, I began my writing career as a critic of the way Vatican II was implemented. I've already criticized, you know, the balloon liturgies and all that stuff, but I was going after what I called a beige Catholicism. I think one of my first published articles was entitled Beige Catholicism. My concern was a Catholicism that had lost its identity, lost its verve, lost its sense of self, lost its missionary elan, was too accommodating to the culture. There's the animal analogy. It allowed the environment to take it over too much. So yes, the implementation of Vatican II, especially in our country, was not done well. If I can invoke Cardinal George one more time, I've never read this anywhere. I think it's a very wise comment he made. He said the death of Cardinal Meyer was a disaster for the American church. So Albert Cardinal Meyer, Archbishop of Chicago in the late 50s, early 60s, great biblical scholar, man that knew the culture very well, was at Vatican II at all the sessions. In fact, was, I think, a president of one of the sessions. He knew it in his bones. He knew what Vatican II was about. He comes home from Vatican II. He meets with all the priests in Chicago. They give him a standing ovation. He died 6 months later. He developed a brain tumor and died. And Cardinal George used to say his death was a disaster because he was the one person best equipped to do what Wojtyła did in Krakow, right? To implement the council through a sort of wise set of protocols. an insider to the council who could implement it well. With his death, there was something of a drift, it seems to me, within the American reception of the council. So I'm okay with that. I think there was a problem there, but it's much wider than that. Read Charles Taylor now. It's what he calls the buffered self. You know, the self that's protected from any contact with the transcendent. And there are a million reasons for that, which I've explored, you know, over the years. But a culture that's becoming increasingly buffered to the transcendent, that's where a lot of this secularism and so on. The culture, I call it, of self-invention, right? The roots of that going back to Nietzsche and coming up through Sartre and Foucault and everyone in our century, that I invent truth, I invent meaning. Think of, you know, our friend von Hildebrand, the beautiful, not what's just subjectively satisfying, but the objectively beautiful. What does it do? It breaks through the ego. It breaks through my little world. It rearranges me. Well, see, that's a very important religious move, because the breaking through of the buffered self now opens it finally to the source of all beauty. And we know how von Hildebrand makes those moves. Same with the truth, same with the good. So I would put my finger there, that it's a loss of the transcendentals, a loss of the ultimate transcendent. Was our implementation of the council not helpful in that regard? Yes, I would say. But don't blame the council. It's not Vatican II. That is not the problem. People like Lubach and Wojtyła and, you know, who were there at Vatican II, Ratzinger, that's not the problem. The buffered self is more the problem.
Yes. Rocco.
Well, I think we should make a good criticism of Council Vatican II that is completely different from the criticism that is usually made. The Council had one idea. The culture of the world of today is a culture that has arrived to a dead end, and they stand in need of conversion. And we must enter into a dialogue with the culture of this world to propose Jesus Christ. When they said the culture of this world, what did they have in their mind? Something completely different from what we have in our mind today. Because the dominating culture was, in that time, the culture of existentialism. The great philosopher was Jean-Paul Sartre. And really, Jean-Paul Sartre had arrived to a dead end. He had no possibility of further development. In one sense, one could say the choice was between suicide and conversion. Then, all of a sudden, you have 1967 and 1968, or in the States, perhaps also 1965. And another issue takes the floor. And Sartre becomes a convert, not to the Catholic Church, but to communism.
To Marxism.
The book, Critique de la Raison Dialectique. And the issue becomes the dialogue with communism. It is not the dialogue that the Council Fathers had in their mind. The world changed all of a sudden, and much of what has been thought, thinking to have as the object of your mission one kind of culture, one kind of man, changes. You have another kind of culture, another kind of man. What happens? That in the West, many people, most people, substitute this idea of the dialogue with Marxism to the idea of the dialogue with existentialism. And instead of entering into a dialogue with the true modern man, they enter into a dialogue with one modern ideology. And here you see the difference of Wojtyła, because he felt never tempted by the dialogue with communism. He had already done his dialogue with communism and arrived to his conclusions. That is, that communism is wrong. You cannot hope to create a new synthesis of communism and Catholicism. No, you have to accept the challenge of communism and show that human fate makes life more human. And that's the reason why there is such a difference between him and some of the others who pretend to be champions of the council. They have accepted the change from existentialism as to Marxism as the key to culture of modernity. And then the second change from Marxism to postmodernism, let us call it as this way. Instead of questioning this ideological formulation of the real demands of the men of today that are not expressed in those ideology. When I was a very young man, I was a young intellectual, and I encountered a priest, Don Francesco Venturino, in Catania. He was a great man, and he was the first man in my life who took me seriously. That is, he did not take seriously what I thought of myself, the image that I wanted to project of myself. And he told me, yes, you want to talk about Sartre, Kierkegaard, yes, well, that's good. We will do that someday. Now, you go in a poor borough of Catania, and you learn to be a friend to the people who live there, to help them one way or another, without the pretension of giving you the solution of their problem, just in order to share their life and to learn what is humanity and how Jesus Christ lives in the life of the poor. Later, we will talk about your intellectual preoccupation, but you will see, we never did. My intellectual preoccupation and my way of thinking changed through life. Now, that is the point, I think. The way of the concretization of the council was a difficult one. And there were many changes, and many did not understand what was happening in the world. And many also had not, well, there is something, I do not come from a Catholic environment, I must confess this. There are many disadvantages, but also some advantages in this. I see that Catholics very often are afraid of struggle, are afraid of entering into a heated discussion, do not possess the art of struggling and remaining friends. I was born in a non-Catholic environment, and great friends of my life have continued to struggle with me, discussing every day, and nevertheless, we remained friends. And I've learned one thing, that in the end, the most important thing is love. People will be convinced to think of the gospel, Jesus. He did not teach like the Pharisees, like the doctors of the law. He taught with authority. What is authority? Authority is the fact that my interlocutor is convinced that I truly love him, that I am really his friend. And what I say because I want him to be happy. When you convince him of this, then real dialogue begins.
Thank you. Well, on this theme of the changing landscape, and I want to sort of flag for our audience that we're coming to the end here. So those of you who've submitted questions, you have a few more moments to submit them, and I'm trying my best to summarize and distill them here. There are many excellent questions. Here's one that I think is very important, and again on people's minds. And I'll ask this to you, Bishop Barron. So, and I'm just going to read here. He says, how can we hope for a synthesis, meaning some kind of positive engagement between Christianity and the broader culture? How can we hope for such a synthesis when the postmodern target culture seems so radically opposed to meaning and transcendence? I do not claim to speak for others, but only anecdotally, having experienced many years in secular circles, it seems many Catholics today find the divide between the Catholic vision of human destiny and the ethos of the average secular American so great as to be entirely incommensurable. Moreover, it seems that any attempt to bridge the gap must make use of language that immediately meets with resistance. One feels poised impotently between insular traditionalism and imprudent, ineffectual evangelism. What would you advise?
Yeah, good. I mean, that's naming the problem in some ways. There's a lot of truth to it. I mean, yes, we are in the midst of a hyper-secularized culture. Again, to mention Charles Taylor, that in 1500, he said, practically everyone believed in God. Now it's a very lively option not to believe in God. And that's something unique. I mean, what's happening in the Western cultures today is unique almost in human history. that people feel they can live a happy life apart from some reference to the transcendent. I face it every single day on my internet sites and social media sites. That you're up against a secularism, the buffered self. So I get it. I get it. There is a real resistance within the culture. But if I can invoke another intellectual hero of mine, the great Monsignor Robert Sokolowski, who taught me years ago at Catholic U. And he used to say, the integrated Catholic culture, let's say from, the 13th century, let's say this integrated Catholic view of the world at the Enlightenment and Reformation, maybe they'll say that at the rise of the modern, blew up. So it exploded. And so it was lost in a way, but yet he said, the twisted, charred pieces of it landed here and there. And so you can see them in the culture. Now, often in distorted form. They're not in perfect form. They're not integrated. They're kind of smoking and twisted, but they're there. One strategy I've used is to look at films. So for a lot of people today, especially young people, music and films are major bearers of the culture. I think you can find, yes, even in this sort of desert landscape of postmodernism, you can find lots of references to the sacred, to the good, to the holy. Now, they won't be right out of, the Council of Trent playbook. They're going to be in somewhat twisted form. That's why some people will look at a movie review that I might do and say, how could you watch? And that's not really, well, no, I get it. I know it's not exactly, Thomas Aquinas, but it's a version of it. There's a remnant of it. There's also, within postmodernism, what they call a nostalgic postmodernism. That's to say one that is not antipathetic to what came before, but actually is looking back behind the modern to things that were occluded by modernity. So there are people in the postmodern, even philosophical space, who are very open to forms of metaphysics and religion and so on that were occluded by modernity. And I've tried to use some of that in my own work as well. So you can listen to the postmoderns themselves and say, well, they're actually open to things that we've preserved and that modernity tended to put aside. So I fully acknowledge the difficulty of it, the reality of what that questioner is describing, but I wouldn't give up so quickly. See, part of it too, Cardinal George again, so he's come to my mind a lot today. He used to say, you can't evangelize a culture that you hate. It doesn't mean you're not critical of it. He was critical of many things in our culture, but ultimately you must love the culture that you're in, otherwise you can't evangelize it. So I don't think we should fall into a, antipathetic stance. The culture is just fallen. It's just hopeless. Run to the hills. No, like Newman's foraging animal, go out into postmodernity, assimilate what you can, resist what you must. In some ways, that's all we can do. Otherwise, we are just going to withdraw, So I would acknowledge it, but say, don't give up too quickly. There's still a lot of semina verbi around.
Indeed. Rocco, this speaks very much to, I think, your entire outlook on the world and the way in which you've been explaining John Paul and the Council to us, but I'll give you a word.
This responds very much also to the way of being of John Paul II. I shall quote a text that was very dear to him. It is the speech of St. Paul to the Areopagus. You remember in the Acts?
Acts 17.
Paul is going up to the mountain, to the Areopagus, and he passes through many altars of the pagan gods, and his soul of pious Jew is furious. How can these people ignore that there is only one God and not so many gods? How can they have altars to gods who have such base passions as the pagan gods have? But when he speaks, he does not vent his indignation. He says, Athenians, the sympathy, Athenians, I see that you are a very religious people. And you see that God has so many sides, so many aspects. And you have even given one altar to the unknown God. He looks the one point in which the defenses against Christ of Greek culture were thinner, weaker, and enters in that point. And from that point, later, with time, he will turn upside down all the structure of the pagan religion. He cannot do this if he has not a sympathy for that culture. If he's not convinced that error is error. But the people who are in the error have some reasons to be in the error. There is some truth in that folly. And if you do not recognize their truth, you will never lead them to abandon that folly. If still they think that there is some truth that you do not want to accept, and you want to deprive them of their truth, then you will be against you. But if they understand that you see their truth better than they do, they will accept that you help them to get rid of all the other elements that make this truth less shining, and will accept to put the truth in the context of the organism of truth. Chesterton says, an error is a truth out of place, out of proportion. You must have this sympathy. This is the first suggestion that I do. When you rate a philosopher, try first of all to understand what is the truth that he has said. And then you have to deconstruct all this book in order to show how this truth finds in Jesus Christ the adequate answer, the adequate response, and all the other is superfluous. Second thing that I would say is learn from my beloved Don Francesco Venturino. Take people seriously, but not too seriously. Don't forget that, Eliot says something similar, by the way, not only Venturino. Don't forget that most of what we say, and of course also other human beings say, is said not to convey a truth about myself, but in order to cover the truth about myself, in order to, it's a way of cheating with myself, because I do not want to see the truth about myself. So try with persons, like with authors, to see what they are really, what they really need. In the last instance, they need Jesus. But in the last instance, immediately, what is the real demand of their hearts? If you can see this, then you are a missionary disciple. Not all missionary disciples must be experts in metaphysics, ethics, philosophy of history, sociology, psychology, and that. And most people are not waiting for a better argument, are waiting for somebody who can read their hearts. And you read the heart of the people you love. If you love, you learn the sapientia cordis, that is the capacity of seeing, not the universal in its abstraction, but the universal in the way in which it is concrete in this person. That is the presence of Jesus in the life of this person. And take one case, homosexuality. I'm ready to explain all the reasons why homosexuality is wrong. You don't know, but in Europe, many people know that I've paid a heavy price just for this reason. But it would not convince. My homosexual friends can rethink their way of life only if they are convinced that I am their best friend. This gives you authority. And when you have authority, all the cultural situation that involves you and your interlocutor will become much less heavy. Not disappear, but it will become much less heavy.
Well, Bishop Barron, it sounds like you should be signing up Rocco Buttiglione for a Word on Fire.
Same spirit.
Yes,
spirit,
very much the same spirit. Well, as we come to the end of our time here, if I could, I want to ask each of you one more thing. And Rocco, I'll give you a heads up and say, I'm going to ask you to perhaps share one final anecdote about John Paul II, since you have so many wonderful stories. Bishop Barron, I was wondering, just in the spirit of the fact that the Hildebrand Project is hosting this event, and in light of your very deep reading of Von Hildebrand right now on beauty and on aesthetics, I thought, I think knowing our audience here, there would be great interest in knowing, just in brief, what your fascination with von Hildebrand is there, what you're trying to achieve in reading him. I know you've got a project, but you've really been, you have a Hildebrand moment, it seems.
Yeah, I've been reading him on and off for many years, but I'm preparing this, I mentioned Cardinal Meyer, the Meyer lecture at Mundelein Seminary, my old stomping grounds. They invited me to give that next March. And it's a major academic lecture, 2 presentations. So it's a major statement. And what I'm trying to do is delve into this problem of the nuns and the buffered self and all that, but in a deeper way. And what I'm doing is looking at the good, the true, and the beautiful as ways to break through the buffered self, you know. So especially in regard to beauty, I've been using a lot of von Hildebrand. I love the reflections on the heart, you know, in him, which I think is a great complement to the tradition's stress on intellect and will. Maybe I'll say one quick thing about von Hildebrand that I really admire. The kind of openness of his Catholic spirit. I'm a Thomist. I got into this operation because as a little kid, I was presented one of Thomas's arguments for God's existence, and it changed my whole life. It opened my mind and my heart in a very powerful way. And I followed Thomas all my life. I've done most of my major academic work on him. I've never written a book that's not deeply indebted to Thomas Aquinas. But I've always been opposed to a kind of closed Thomism that would just close it in as a system. Everything else is problematic. And I prefer an open Thomism. Thomism, it's the French would call it pierre de touche. You know, it's my touchstone is always Thomas. But Thomas open to the Augustinian strain of the tradition, open to the Bonaventurian strain, open to contemporary thinkers, open to someone like von Balthasar or Ratzinger, who's not very Thomist, etc. I think that's a healthier way to do it. I would admire the fact that von Hildebrand, as he becomes a Catholic, so he's not trained in a classical Thomism, doesn't come up in that world, but uses phenomenology, uses Husserl and Scheler and so many others. Eventually came to know Aquinas, of course, but had this breadth of mind. I like that. That's a very Catholic spirit, it seems to me. Look at Newman, one of our shared heroes. Newman, he did have knowledge of Aquinas, but he's certainly not an Aquinas man. He's operating on a very different philosophical framework. Good. I think you can be a Thomist and you can be a Newman man, you can be a von Hildebrand man, you can be a Ratzinger man, a Bonaventure man, an Augustine man at the same time, because I think that's called being a Catholic person in spirit. So I've always admired that in von Hildebrand.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for your, I remind our readers that you were the author of the preface for Liturgy and Personality, which was our first book as the Hildebrand Press. So I thank you for that. Rocco, if I can invite you to share one of your many wonderful stories, I could suggest one, but I imagine you have something in mind. But this is such a gift that you can offer us.
Well, look, I have been a friend of John Paul II. I had a dinner with him, I had lunch with him, I worked with him, I have sung with him. He could sing very well, I know. Anyway, but when he comes back in my dreams, what comes back is the first time I saw him. I was a boy in a crowd. He passed by. He watched me directly in the eyes. He gave me his hand. And I had the distinct perception. This is a man who would give his life for you if need be. Mm. And I say this because I've talked to many people who have said to me the same thing. People who later became his friends, people who met him only once in their lives, and many, many people repeated to me that this is what they felt when they met him. And if you meet a man like this, and he's not your father, I can imagine that my father would have given his life for me, or my mother, my sisters, perhaps. But if he's not your father, your mother, your sisters, your wife, your husband, then at least the doubt, not the certitude, the doubt that this love must have a supernatural root, this doubt you must have. And this doubt accompanies you throughout all your life.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful story. And you described how often you've spoken, Rocco, about how there were these sort of concentric circles of the friendship of Wojtyła, to the extent that people who'd never met him before, but met a friend of Wojtyła, somehow felt then that they were incorporated into the friendship that he extended to them.
Not only, his friends talked about him to their friends and talked to him about their friends. And he had a heart for everybody.
Yeah. Well, I thank you, both of you, so very much. Bishop Barron, this was very gracious of you to make time for us and to join this conversation.
It was a joy for me. Thanks. No,
Yes.
joy.
And I'm so glad that we could bring you and Rocco together in a conversation like this. And I'm sure that when you see each other in Rome, there will be opportunities to continue this conversation.
I savor that prospect.
I hope so.
Yes, indeed. And Rocco, thank you very much. Rocco has been a friend who has been, well, as one of my favorite expressions for generosity, Rocco has been truly a river to his people. He has been so good to the Hildebrand Project and a participant in our work from the very beginning. So it is always a joy. I feel, Rocco, that when you're with us, that there's a little bit of John Paul II who's with us as well in your spirit. And I want to thank all of you for being with us today. I see we've had a wonderful group of participants, many questions. Most of you are participants in our summer seminar. Some of you are special guests. I invite any of you who are not already on the Hildebrand Project's email list to join that so that you can be kept abreast of wonderful events like this very event today. I invite you to follow us on social media, where we are also very, very active. And as you can imagine, a project like this is supported through the generosity of our benefactors. I like to say that the Hildebrand Project has picked the most difficult of all possible causes. We are here promoting the legacy of a dead, white, male, German philosopher. So it doesn't get any more difficult than that, at least on paper. On the other hand, those of you who've begun to taste his spirit know that what a sursum corda, what a lifting up of the heart it is to encounter him in his work and in his life. So I invite all of you to consider becoming benefactors of the project. That is how our work is carried on. I thank many of you who are already our benefactors for being with us and supporting us. There are many of you with us in this conversation who are the lifeblood of the project, and I thank you all very, very much. So on that note, I bring to a conclusion our time together. Bishop Barron, again, thank you so very much.
My pleasure.
And Rocco, you as well. God bless you all.
God bless you.
My pleasure. God bless.